Present day. Present time.
Serial Expirements Lain is a one-of-a-kind show, even in the eccentric and bizarre world of anime. Anime has long since been a medium that is almost slavish to its conventions out of fear of isolating its audience, and it is refreshing to see something like Lain that flies in the face of all of that and does its own unique storytelling and atmosphere without compromise. The atmosphere of Lain is an unyielding through line in the entire series. Many scenes feel like it has a distance and a hollowness to them. Like when Lain is just walking around in the neighborhood that surrounds her house, you get to view how desolate and devoid the landscape is. It uses simple things like that to really give the feeling of the artificiality to the world that Lain inhabits. What really amps those little things up is its use of sound alongside the soundtrack by Nakaido Reichi. One of the most memorable uses of sound would be when a specific sound in a scene overtakes everything else and becomes the main focus of the viewer's attention, and uses it to transition from the seemingly real world to the undefined and surreal visions that occur in the show.
Iwakura-san?
The soundtrack is also purposefully used sparingly to fill in some of the atmosphere when a scene needs to be something that can't be conveyed in its naturalistic sound effects alone. The songs themselves are great on their own, to say the least. Songs like the Siberia Club theme, Lain's theme, and my personal favorite, The Wind of Space and Time. These songs, while all sounding distinct, still blend in seamlessly when used in the show. I also love how on the reprised version of Lain's theme, the acoustic guitar has a lessened presence on the song and no longer opens it, which feels more symbolic of the events that occur later in the show. But all that being said, what makes the use of music more impactful is how it is used to interrupt the lack of music in the story. Most of the time, scenes that lack music make the environments feel more real to the viewer, and scenes where the music cuts out abruptly create a stark transition between it, and is often used to distort the sense of reality that the viewer has on the world. The story that is told in Serial Expirements Lain lives between that blurred sense of reality, which makes the narrative more difficult to understand than the average anime. Most likely, after watching Lain for the first time, the first word that will come out of your mouth will be, "What?" Serial Expirements Lain is something that requires self-reflection and some processing to even begin to comprehend what you just watched. To me, the narrative really didn't click with me until I watched the series the whole way through on the second time. But after watching it, I have come to my own conclusion on what Serial Expirements Lain means to me. Before I begin my analysis of Serial Expirements Lain, I'd like to remind you that you should watch the show first before watching this analysis of the show, because I do go into the show a lot and dissect certain aspects of the show, so be warned. Honestly, I had a few theories of what happens in the show. While I find it fun to think about the show and to speculate on certain aspects of the show and how they can be interpreted differently, but the most prevalent line of thinking that I've had about the show, how the story and themes of the show are prophetic about self-isolation. While saying that's the only thing that the series tackles would be selling it tremendously short. This theme feels like it's the most prevalent in the modern age, where most of our communication takes place digitally. Over the course of the series, we see the effects that the internet has on people in both a negative and positive manner, Lain being the most clear example of both. Initially, Lain wants to use the internet, or the wired as they call it in the show, to be able to talk to her friends. And yes, that does include the dead one, but whatever. And in some ways, it seemingly helps Lain to the point that her friends immediately spot the change in her demeanor. And most of the theories surrounding the show say that this change is due to a second personality being present, and while I understand where that is coming from, I think that this newfound confidence that Lain has doesn't come from a new personality. It comes from her gaining that confidence from her communication with others on the Wired that allow her to be more outgoing in real life. And whenever she seemingly slips back into her original personality, it usually is in sync with the negative events that happen to her on the Wired. Now, what might these negative events, as I put it, happen to be? Well, it's harassment of her family and friends, DDoSing, abduction, installation of harmful things on a computer system that in this case destroys your physical well-being and almost kills her, and almost killing her in person. The most important of those things off that list being the harassment, because it's not just any form of harassment, it's persistent and psychologically draining harassment, and she is not the only one to receive this on the show. We get this from the very opening scene of the series, when Chisa jumps off the roof of a building, but before that happens, we see the message that she receives stating, "Why should you do that is something you need to figure out for yourself." The "that" in that sentence being her suicide, and the reason why, as we find out later in the first episode, in the email that she sent to Lain, is because she believed that she was only giving up her physical form, and she was able to meet God on the Wired. Lain manages to meet this God character even before she plants in the psyche chip into her Navi, which may be related to odder experiences that she has in general on her train rides that are more likely stemming from the traumatic nightmares that she had on the first episode. But back to what I was saying. Lain talks to this false deity on the Wired for the first time on this train, and it's the start of a very combative relationship with him from that point forward. That's why God's fan group, or this God's fan group, known as the Knights, have spent a lot of time harassing her, which leads Lain down odd rabbit holes to seemingly come up with some form of explanation as to why the God of the Wired acts like this towards Lain, which comes to a head at episode 9, Protocol, which is by far the most bizarre episode of the show, mostly because the expository narration doesn't really make any semblance of sense until it reveals the true identity of the God of the Wired, who is supposedly the developer on the Wired named Masami Eri. Eri and his knights spend their time trying to convince Lain to follow in the footsteps of Chisa and to abandon her humanity and leave for the Wired. This offer becomes increasingly enticing due to the fact that her will is being progressively broken, her reality is seemingly crumbling, and the harassment seemingly has a purpose, or Lain tries to convince herself that it does at least. Lain comes up with these explanations as a coping mechanism to help her process all of these bizarre events that she witnesses. Over the course of the 13-episode run of Serial Experiments Lain, we see Lain become increasingly more detached from reality and more antisocial with her use of the Wired. She comes up with fantasy after fantasy where she is not excluded from her classmates due to the false accusations of privacy evasions that done by the Knights acting as Lain. And her detachment and antisocial behavior stems from her seeing the futility in her actions she takes. And she tries to right the wrongs of both the Wired and her reality, but manages to do very little in both. Like in episode 4, when Lain is investigating these odd deaths occurring caused by a game in the Wired, bleeding into reality, but by the time she figures out what's going on, it's way too late, and it claims yet another victim. This is one of the many horrific things she experiences in the Wired that makes Lain more jaded, and when that finally crosses over into the real world, it pushes her to the point where she feels like self-destructing. Literally. Her detachment from reality is shown in many ways in Lain's life. She becomes increasingly cold towards her friends, and more importantly, she begins to believe that her family is not her family. Actors hired to push Lain even further towards abandoning her humanity and uploading herself to the Wired, which in most theories is what actually happens in the story, But the fact that her father, who was the one who encouraged her to go to the Wired in the first place, has multiple scenes where he tries to convince her to step back from the Wired and to see it as separate from the real world.
ずいぶん慣れてきたようだね。ワイヤードとの付き合い。
うん。
一つだけ忠告しておこう。
え？
ワイヤードはあくまでも情報を伝達し、コミュニケーションするための空間、リアルワールドと混同してはいけない。忠告の意味、わかるかな？
But in contrast to that, there are also other scenes where Lain has conversations with representations of what she thinks her parents think if they were a part of that organization, and that's why when finally asks her parents about them not being her parents, is met with a cold glaze from both of them. This shows how negative of an impact The Wired has had on Lain's thought process, and how she can no longer accept reality in a tangible fashion and seeks to numb her dread inside The Wired. Now, after saying all of that, does that mean everyone should leave the internet, abandon technology, and join Vanilla Ice and his Amish farmer friends? No, I don't think that the point of Serial Experiments Lain was something as blunt as technology bad. I think that the show does a good job at showing the pitfalls that the internet can have. But more importantly, I think that the show does a good job at showing us that having human connections are important. That human connection, for Lain, takes shape in the form of her classmate, Arisu. Arisu is the closest thing Lain has to a real friend throughout the whole series. Arisu is the one who tries to reach out to Lain the most out of all of her classmates, inviting her to do things with others, trying to include her in on the conversation, and overall just being a net positive on her life. And when Arisu gets hurt by someone who's imitating Lain, Lain sees that the world has turned completely against her, and she tries to fix it in the same way that Arisu's other friends tried to do, by acting like nothing ever happened. And despite Lain's shoddy attempt to rectify how she wronged her, Arisu is what saves Lain from suffering the same fate of that of Chisa. The difference between them is that Lain was able to find a tangible connection to the real world, and Chisa was not. This also leads to the only way she manages to defeat Eri, by completely shattering his philosophy, by making him assume a human form, thus proving the importance of the real world. As enticing as the internet, or in this case, The Wired may be, it's important not to carelessly push away people in your life. Serial Experiments Lain does an amazing job at portraying the mental decline that Lain experiences during this show due to her pushing the people in her life away. If you remove the somewhat surreal and fantastical way that the show presents them, the story of Lain does not feel far from normal anymore. Especially with the explosion of people who are NEETs in the last 20 years, especially in Japan, where 1.2 million people have identified as shut-ins or hikikomori. At the end of Serial Experiments Lain, I believe that despite finding her connection with humanity, she sees Arisu's petrified expression and decides not to enter the real world, but also not to leave for the Wired, showing that she has found some meaning in her existence, and she wants to live in the real world, but she can't help but imagine that the world without her is much better than the one with. While she does have a love and understanding for the real world, she is scared that the world will continue to be as frightening as it was before. This is the thinking that has led people to be afraid of the world and has made them retreat from society, becoming NEETs. Once you enter this state of constant fear, it's hard to break free from it, and Lain does not do that. Once you enter this constant state of fear, it's hard to break free from the fear that the doubt in your mind will plague you and always be looming over you, just like it does for Lain. Only until you realize that in this world, you don't need to face it alone, it will continue to loom over you. Thank you for watching this video. I thought I'd try something new, and hopefully I did a good job at analyzing this show, and I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on it. And I'd also like to thank Che Graphics for the thumbnail. And I will see you guys in the next video whenever I post that.